Bonaparte. The tragic rise and fall of Napoleon Bonaparte. The night drapes softly over the quiet sea, where the wind carries echoes of cannon fire long faded. Somewhere between the hush of the waves and the whisper of memory, a man's shadow still lingers, small in stature, vast in story. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte, a dreamer born of storms, a soldier of destiny, a ruler who once held the heartbeat of the world in his palm. But even the brightest fire must dim, and even empires once golden must learn the silence of night. Tonight, beneath the slow turning of the stars, we will drift through his story, not in the noise of battle, but in the calm after. We will walk with him through ambition and exile, through triumph and ruin, tracing how one man's dream could lift a nation and break it in the same breath. So, settle softly into the dark. Let the world outside fall away. If these words carry you closer to rest, let this channel stay by your side too, a quiet companion in the hush of history. Because every rise, no matter how mighty, carries within it the tender promise of a fall. And in that fall lies the beauty of being human. Chapter 1: The Island Child and the Fire Within. In the cradle of the Mediterranean, where waves hum ancient songs against the cliffs of Corsica, a boy was born beneath a sky of soft silver. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte. The wind carried it first, a name small as a whisper, soon to echo through centuries. The island was his first teacher, and its loneliness his first lesson. It was a place caught between two worlds, wild mountains and gentle shores, rebellion and serenity. And from this divided soil, a divided spirit was born, one destined to dream beyond its boundaries. As a child, he wandered the rugged hills where olive trees twisted toward the sun. He studied the patterns of wind across the sea, the slow drift of clouds over the horizon. While other boys played, Napoleon listened to the rhythm of silence, to the stillness that hides within restlessness. He learned that solitude can be a kind of strength, that the quiet mind sees what others overlook. His mother, Letizia, strong and solemn, raised him with iron tenderness. She believed discipline was a form of love, and so he grew under the weight of both. At night, when the sea glimmered beneath the moon, he would stare into the distance and imagine worlds unseen, empires perhaps, though he did not yet know their shape. The stars above Corsica were not gentle, they burned fiercely, as if reminding him that destiny is not granted, but taken. His father, Carlo, filled their home with talk of politics and pride, the endless struggle of Corsica's identity between France and Italy. He listened, absorbing every word like kindling. Even then, he was learning to turn ideas into fire. When he was 9, his father sent him to France to study, a foreign land, a foreign tongue. The journey was harsh, the sea restless, and as the ship rocked beneath gray skies, he felt a deep, unshakable loneliness. In France, his accent betrayed him. The other boys mocked him, the Corsican savage, they called him. But ridicule only sharpened his resolve. The same isolation that once wounded him now became his weapon. He would learn faster, read deeper, think longer. He would rise above them all. In the quiet of his dormitory at Brienne, he devoured books. Caesar, Alexander, Plutarch. He read of men who bent fate to their will, and he began to wonder if such power could belong not just to kings or noble blood, but to anyone who dared to dream beyond their station. Sometimes he stood at the window, the winter light soft on his face, and whispered to himself, "One day." That word became his prayer, his promise, his shadow. Years passed, and the boy hardened into purpose. By 16, Napoleon graduated from the École Militaire in Paris, the youngest in his class. The city around him pulsed with change. The poor starved, while the rich danced in gold salons. France was a volcano beneath its silken mask, trembling toward eruption. He could feel it in the air, like electricity before a storm. He sensed, though he could not yet name it, that the world was about to break open, and that he, somehow, was meant to stand within that crack. Paris was not kind to him. He was poor, proud, and quiet. His uniform was threadbare, his meals often skipped. Yet he carried himself with the gravity of someone born to command. He walked the streets at dusk, watching the city shift from splendor to decay. The flicker of candles in windows, the smell of bread and smoke, the distant hum of carriages fading into the night. Sometimes he would stop by the Seine, gaze at the reflection of the moon, and feel the vastness of his own ambition. It frightened him, that hunger to be more than a man. When the revolution began, it felt to him like destiny calling. France tore itself apart, kings toppled, mobs shouted, blood flowed in the name of liberty. But amid chaos, Napoleon saw clarity. Where others saw danger, he saw the opening of history, his chance, his moment. At Toulon in 1793, when Royalist and British forces seized the port, a young artillery officer named Bonaparte proposed a plan so daring that it bordered on madness. Cannons placed where no one had imagined, firing in perfect unison under the cover of smoke and night. It was strategy turned into poetry. The plan worked. The British fled. Toulon fell. And the name, Napoleon Bonaparte, no longer Bonaparte, the foreigner, began to ripple through France like the first notes of an anthem. He was 24, thin, pale, eyes burning with restless intensity. France was starving for order, and in that hunger, it saw in him not just a soldier, but a savior. Promotion followed swiftly. He moved through ranks like wind through grass, unstoppable, unseen, inevitable. But victory awakened something deeper. It whispered of destiny, of greatness. And once a man begins to believe that fate favors him, the path forward becomes both luminous and perilous. Napoleon began to see not just battles, but patterns, maps of meaning, movements of nations like pieces on a chessboard. The revolution's fire became his forge, and ambition its flame. He fell briefly, politically exiled, his career nearly undone by the shifting tides of power. But even in despair, he did not break. He wrote, "I am made for great things, and until I accomplish them, all is misery." His conviction was no longer hope, it was faith. Then came Italy, the campaign that would turn him from a rising star into a legend. The army he inherited was starving, barefoot, hopeless. He promised them victory, glory, food, and gave them all three. In Lodi, he led from the front, crossing the bridge under fire, sword raised, his coat drenched in smoke and sweat. In that moment, he saw what others could not, that courage when bound to will can move mountains. His men began to follow him not for command, but for belief. They said he carried lightning in his voice, that when he spoke, the air itself seemed to listen, and perhaps it did. He made them dream that their suffering had meaning, that their struggle was a chapter in a story greater than themselves. Under his banner, they marched like believers following a prophet. In the quiet after each victory, Napoleon stood alone. The roar of battle faded, replaced by the whisper of wind through burned fields. He would watch the smoke rise and think of Corsica, of the sea, of the boy who once dreamed of stars. Now, the stars seemed closer, and yet farther than ever. He was no longer the child watching the horizon. He was the horizon itself. And yet, in that vastness, something gentle began to fade. The warmth that once lit his ambition turned colder, more calculating. He began to write less to his family, more to the future. To his mother he sent medals, to his brothers commands. The tenderness of youth was giving way to the machinery of power. And yet, on rare nights, when the sky was clear and the campfires low, he would stand beside his horse and gaze into the distance. The soldiers sleeping nearby would not see the shadow in his eyes, the quiet question that haunted him. If I conquer the world, will I still be alone? The fire that once burned to prove himself had become a flame consuming everything in its path. And somewhere, deep within that fire, the boy from the island still whispered to the man he was becoming, asking if all this was truly worth the silence it brought. The answer would take years to unfold, across continents, thrones, and graves, but already history had chosen him, and like a tide that never retreats, it began to pull him toward destiny. As the night deepened and the smoke of victory rose into the stars, the world took its first quiet breath before the storm that would follow him. The boy from Corsica, once mocked, once forgotten, now stood at the threshold of empire. Chapter 2: The Conqueror of Europe. Morning rose over Italy like a slow breath, pale gold spilling across the hills, the smell of earth and smoke lingering after battle. Napoleon stood at the edge of a ruined field, his coat fluttering in the wind, eyes fixed on the horizon. Around him, the landscape was quiet, as though holding its breath after the storm. He had done what few believed possible. France, once divided and starved, now stood victorious. Its soldiers, half naked and barefoot when they began, marched with pride and sang his name as if it were a prayer. Vive Bonaparte echoed through valleys like a hymn of rebirth. But even in triumph, his heart was restless. Victory had not satisfied the fire, it had fed it. The taste of power was intoxicating, and he began to crave not the end of conquest, but the next beginning. The Italian campaign had revealed to him something he had long suspected, that he was not merely to serve history, but to command it. He walked through the streets of Milan like a man both adored and feared. Crowds gathered to see him, to touch the hem of his uniform, to whisper that he was sent by Providence. And in the candlelit chambers of old palaces, where marble statues watched from the corners, he began to speak of things greater than battles, of Europe, of order, of destiny reborn from chaos. The air itself seemed to lean toward him when he spoke. He was small in stature, but his presence filled rooms like thunder waiting to break. His words came fast, sharp, alive, a mix of reason and poetry. He could silence generals twice his age with a glance. Even those who hated him could not ignore him. There was something magnetic, something inevitable about his will. And yet, in quieter hours, His pen revealed another man, one uncertain, longing, almost tender. His letters to Josephine brimmed with passion, jealousy, and loneliness. He adored her, though she would often wound him with silence. He wrote, "I wake thinking of you, and the earth seems empty when I do not find you beside me." But as the campaigns went on, her absence grew longer, her letters fewer, and a subtle ache began to root inside him, the loneliness of a man surrounded by worship, yet untouched by understanding. In Paris, the Directory trembled. The generals were growing too powerful, the people too restless. Napoleon returned like a storm to the capital, not as a soldier, but as a savior. The government paraded him through the streets, desperate to borrow his glory. He smiled, waved, but said little. His eyes, always scanning, saw weakness everywhere. France had won battles, but lost its soul. It was a nation without direction, leaders without vision, and he began to wonder, perhaps aloud, perhaps only in thought, if he might be the one to restore it. Then came Egypt, a dream dressed in sunlight and sand. He imagined himself not merely a conqueror, but a philosopher king, bringing civilization's torch to the east. His ship sailed across the glittering waters of the Mediterranean, carrying scholars, scientists, artists, an army of both war and wisdom. When they landed in Alexandria, he told his men, "From the height of these pyramids, 40 centuries look down upon you." The words rang like prophecy. The desert tested him in ways Europe never had. The heat was relentless, the horizon endless, the silence deeper than prayer. Battles raged against the Mamluks and the Ottomans, victories carved in dust and blood. Yet amid triumph, he found wonder. The stars burning brighter than anywhere he had seen, the ancient stones of temples whispering secrets older than kings. He studied hieroglyphs, questioned astronomers, walked among ruins, and felt, perhaps for the first time, the humility of time itself. But time is a patient thief. While he chased glory beneath Egyptian suns, Europe changed without him. The British destroyed his fleet at Aboukir Bay, cutting him off from France. The Directory back home grew weaker still, collapsing under corruption, and whispers reached him, Josephine's betrayal, her unfaithfulness while he was gone. The letters he wrote then were sharp, wounded things. He told her, "You weep, but your tears are false. I despise you, yet I love you still." The conqueror who had commanded armies now found himself defeated by the smallest of human frailties, love unreturned. It was perhaps his first true loss. And so he left Egypt as quietly as he had arrived, slipping past the British blockade under the cover of night. His men, bewildered and abandoned, called after him, but he did not turn back. The sea that had once carried him to adventure now carried him home to destiny. When he returned to France, the people were waiting. The nation was broken, weary, hungry for strength. The moment he stepped ashore, the air seemed to change. He was no longer merely a general. He was the embodiment of order. In the halls of power, conspiracies swirled like smoke. The coup of Brumaire was swift and bloodless. The old government fell without a cry. And when it was over, Napoleon stood in silence before the council, his hand resting inside his coat, his gaze unwavering. "Citizens," he said softly, "the revolution is over." And in that moment, the republic died, not in chaos, but in calm. He was 30 years old. The boy from Corsica had become the ruler of France. But even as his throne rose, shadows gathered.
In the stillness of his study, long after midnight, he would sometimes walk to the window and stare out over Paris. The lamps glowed faintly through the fog, the city asleep beneath him. He felt both the master and the captive of his own dream. I found the crown of France lying in the gutter, and I picked it up with the sword, he would later say. But even he did not know that the crown he grasped so easily would one day crush him beneath its weight.
The conqueror had begun his ascent, and the world, trembling beneath his feet, could only watch. And so, as the night deepened and the echoes of revolution faded into history's hum, the man who had once been an island child now held an entire continent in his hands, and still it was not enough. For when a man begins to conquer the world, he often discovers he is only fleeing himself. Chapter 3. The Emperor of Dreams. The streets of Paris pulsed with life, a rhythm both chaotic and precise, like the beating of a living organism. Horse-drawn carriages rattled over cobblestones, vendors called their wares with practiced urgency, and children darted through alleys, their laughter a fragile counterpoint to the murmurs of politics and intrigue. Above it all, the Tuileries rose, a testament to ambition and order, a palace that mirrored the mind of the man who commanded it. Napoleon moved within that world as both conductor and participant, sensing the movements of men and nations as one might feel the swell and ebb of the tide. In his study, maps were spread like woven tapestries, each line and color representing the reach of empires and the ambitions of kings. Letters from distant capitals lay in neat stacks, bearing news of alliances, rebellions, and betrayals. Napoleon's eyes, sharp and calculating, scanned the dispatches with a mixture of strategy and intuition. He could see not only the letters' words, but the intent behind them, the hesitation of a hesitant monarch, the hidden envy of a general, the treacherous delight of an enemy waiting for the opportune moment. Each decision, each order was a thread in the intricate web he wove across Europe. Yet even as he orchestrated the vast machinery of empire, there were moments when the man behind the myth could be glimpsed. Alone in his chambers, he would sometimes stare into the pale morning light filtering through tall windows, seeing not triumph, but the faces of those lost to war, the soldiers who fell in frozen fields, the civilians whose lives were swept away in the wake of his ambitions. These ghosts were silent, yet their presence lingered in the corners of his mind, shaping a ruler who could combine ruthlessness with unexpected empathy, ambition with a rare sensitivity to the human cost of power. Napoleon's genius was not only in strategy, but in perception. He understood that victory was as much a product of imagination as of artillery. To move an army was to move hearts. To bend the will of nations was to craft narratives that inspired awe and fear in equal measure. He was the emperor of dreams because he could make others believe in the impossible, see the world not only as it was, but as it might be if he willed it so. His soldiers marched not merely because of discipline, but because they followed a vision larger than themselves, a dream of glory that was as intoxicating as it was terrifying. Even in the corridors of power, his presence was magnetic. Ministers, marshals, and diplomats felt the pull of his mind, a force that could dominate conversation, bend debate, and unearth hidden truths with a single question or glance. Some revered him, others feared him, but all knew that to underestimate Napoleon was to court disaster. His reputation had become a weapon in itself, spreading across courts and capitals like wildfire, shaping alliances and stoking apprehension far from the fields of battle. The city itself seemed to mirror the paradox of its emperor, grand, ordered, yet alive with undercurrents of unrest. Cafes and salons buzzed with the chatter of citizens, gossip laced with hope, envy and apprehension.
Revolution had not died, it had transformed, and in its new form, it required both the hand of a firm ruler and the vision of a dreamer. Napoleon navigated this delicate balance with the precision of a master craftsman, shaping public perception while guiding policy, bending loyalty without breaking it. Yet even mastery demanded vigilance. Letters from Vienna hinted at conspiracies, the distant mutterings of generals questioned his authority, and across the continent, the restless ambitions of monarchs simmered beneath polite diplomacy. Napoleon understood that empires were won not only through cannon and sword, but through the architecture of trust, the careful cultivation of belief, and the silent manipulation of perception. One step, one misjudged word, and the fragile edifice of his dominion could collapse. Still, for all the weight of power, Napoleon never lost the intimacy of imagination. In the quiet hours, when the empire slumbered, he imagined the possibilities of the future, the campaigns that might extend his influence, the treaties that might secure his legacy, the legends that might immortalize him. His mind was a battlefield of visions, each more ambitious than the last, a place where strategy and fantasy intertwined until they became indistinguishable. In these moments, he was not merely a man, but an idea, a force of will capable of shaping the destiny of nations. And yet, with all his grandeur, there remained solitude. Surrounded by advisors and generals, cheered by citizens, he knew the emperor's burden could be borne only alone. In the silence of his chambers, the mind that commanded Europe wrestled with questions no victory could answer. What is the measure of power? What is the cost of ambition? And what, in the end, is the fate of a man who dares to bend the world to his dreams? The morning deepened, and Paris glowed beneath the rising sun, gilding rooftops and river alike. Napoleon moved through the palace, through the city, through history itself, leaving traces that would echo long after he had passed. He was a man of contradictions, both human and legendary, a dreamer whose visions could build empires or shatter them, a soldier whose mind was a crucible of strategy and imagination. He was the emperor of dreams, and in every street, every letter, every silent glance, the world could feel the sweep of his ambition, the brilliance of his intellect, and the indelible mark of his presence upon history itself. The empire stretched across Europe, a mosaic of conquered lands and reluctant allies, yet for Napoleon, maps and borders were only the beginning. Each region had its own pulse, its own fears and loyalties, and the art of rule required sensing the subtleties invisible to most. In Italy, he navigated the delicate ambitions of local princes. In Egypt, he pondered the ancient sands that whispered of glory and ruin. In Austria, he balanced treaties with the ever-present threat of betrayal. Everywhere, he moved with the certainty of a man who believed that history itself could be guided by vision and will. War, of course, remained the ultimate test. Napoleon's campaigns were legendary, not only for their tactical brilliance, but for their psychological precision. At Austerlitz, he had deceived an entire coalition, making the enemy see weakness where there was none and opportunity where none existed. Armies moved like pieces on a board he could see in its entirety, yet each piece carried the lives of men who trusted him with their fates. Victory demanded calculation, yes, but also the ability to inspire loyalty and courage, to make men believe they were part of something greater than themselves, a dream made flesh on fields of mud, smoke, and cannon fire.
Yet battles were only part of the story. Napoleon understood that empires could falter not on the battlefield, but in the hearts of those who serve them. Diplomacy, alliances, marriages, decrees, and proclamations, all were instruments in the symphony of rule. He could charm a minister into loyalty, intimidate a king into submission, and manipulate a populace into devotion.
and he did so with a brilliance that often seemed supernatural. But even he could not fully escape the fragility of human nature, and every decision carried the shadow of unintended consequence. Among those closest to him, the tension between admiration and fear was constant. Josephine, radiant and unpredictable, captivated him with the grace that could temper his stormiest moods. Yet even love required calculation. The heart, like the battlefield, was a space where errors could prove costly. His generals, brilliant and ambitious, watched and waited, measuring loyalty against personal ambition, their own dreams intertwining with the destiny of the empire. Napoleon moved among them like a conductor guiding a complex orchestra, attuned to every discordant note, ready to reshape the symphony before it fell into chaos. Even as he solidified power, Napoleon was haunted by the whispers of doubt and rumor. Europe's monarchs, bruised but unbowed, plotted, negotiated, and wove intrigues meant to unseat him. He knew that empires were temporary, that legends were fragile, and that every triumph could seed the conditions for downfall. And yet, within him burned an audacity that refused to yield to fear, a conviction that he could shape the course of history with the same certainty he had once shaped the destiny of a single battalion. At night, the emperor often wandered the halls of the Tuileries alone, listening to the city breathe beneath him. The soft hum of Paris, the distant clatter of hooves, the muted cries of joy and despair, all were part of the rhythm he had learned to feel as instinctively as his own heartbeat. In those hours, he was both man and myth, aware of his mortality and yet compelled by the enormity of his vision. He dreamed not only of empires, but of immortality, not only of conquest, but of a legacy that would outlast crowns, cannons, and centuries. The world outside was restless. Revolutions flickered like storm lanterns in Spain and Naples. The seas teemed with the fleets of Britain, ever watchful and unyielding. Yet Napoleon moved with the fluidity of a mind attuned to possibility. He saw opportunity where others saw danger, turning political crises into strategic advantage, transforming setbacks into lessons, and weaving every experience into the narrative of his ambition. Even with such extraordinary vision, the emperor's humanity remained palpable. In quiet moments, he pondered the cost of his dreams, the bloodshed, the families disrupted, the lives forever altered by the march of armies and the decree of law. He was neither callous nor detached. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, that greatness demanded sacrifice. And yet, that sacrifice was not abstract. It was lived and felt by countless individuals whose fates he bore upon his conscience. And still he pressed forward. Paris, vibrant and restless, was his stage, but Europe was the theatre of his imagination. His mind leapt across mountains, rivers, and borders, seeing battles before they occurred, anticipating moves and countermoves with the precision of a master strategist. Generals deferred to his judgment, ministers relied on his vision, and even rivals could not fully comprehend the speed and scope of his intellect. Napoleon was a storm contained within the body of a man, a tempest that reshaped the world with every decision, every word, every command. As the chapter of morning turned to afternoon and afternoon to evening, Napoleon's empire continued its relentless expansion not merely in territory, but in myth, in imagination, in the very consciousness of Europe. He was a man whose dreams could alter reality, whose vision could bend nations, and whose ambition illuminated the sky like a comet streaking across the night. Yet even in his brilliance, there lingered the quiet question that shadowed all great men. How long could a dream endure before the weight of the world pressed it to the ground? Paris, lit now by the golden hue of dusk, held its breath as if sensing the significance of every footstep in the palace, every whisper in the streets. Napoleon walked through the corridors, through the empire, through history itself, and in his wake he left traces that would echo far beyond the limits of time. He was, in every sense, the emperor of dreams, a man who conjured empires from thought, who commanded devotion from millions, who transformed the fragile and fleeting into something enduring and monumental. And in that brilliance, haunted, solitary, unstoppable, he was poised to shape the world, one dream, one victory, one irrevocable moment at a time. Chapter 4. The Iron Tide. The roar of cannons echoed across distant fields like the heartbeat of a restless continent. Napoleon Bonaparte, ever the master of strategy and spectacle, stood upon a ridge overlooking the French armies, his figure a dark silhouette against the pale dawn. The air smelled of gunpowder, wet earth, and the faint metallic tang of blood. Yet, even amidst the chaos of war, there was a strange clarity, a rhythm, a pattern, a logic that only he could perceive. Armies moved as he imagined them, not merely as men and horses, but as extensions of his will. Each battalion a stroke of genius upon the vast canvas of Europe. The iron tide, as contemporaries would later call it, swept through nations with relentless force. From the snow-swept plains of Austria to the winding rivers of Italy, Napoleon's campaigns reshaped borders, toppled dynasties, and forced reluctant allies into submission. At Austerlitz, he had demonstrated the terrifying poetry of warfare, deceiving entire coalitions with precision that seemed almost supernatural. But victory was never simple, and even triumph carried its own burdens. The field, littered with the casualties of ambition, whispered reminders of mortality, a silent chorus to temper the umpire's grandeur. Napoleon's mind was a crucible of calculation. Each maneuver, each strategy was infused with an acute awareness of psychology as much as logistics. He understood that armies could be broken not only by musket and cannon, but by doubt, fear, and awe. Soldiers marched harder when inspired, retreated sooner when demoralized, and he, more than any general in history, knew how to bend human will to his designs. Letters from generals, intelligence reports from spies, and whispers from occupied cities were all pieces of a puzzle he solved with uncanny clarity. Europe was not merely a map. It was a living, breathing organism, and he had learned to feel its pulse.
Yet the higher he climbed, the more precarious his position became. Victory bred envy and fear in equal measure. Kings plotted in shadows, ministers whispered treachery, and rival empires watched the spread of French influence with suspicion and malice. Napoleon knew that the true challenge of power was not the enemy at the front lines, but the one behind the walls of diplomacy, hidden in the smiles of allies and the subtle gestures of those sworn to loyalty. To rule, he realized, was to navigate a river of knives and mirrors, where one misstep could undo a lifetime of conquest. Even in the midst of war, Paris remained his anchor. The Tuileries Palace, the Seine's reflective calm, the bustling streets and markets, all these reminded him of the stakes beyond the battlefield. Soldiers fought, yes, but nations lived and breathed. Politics, commerce, and public sentiment were as vital to victory as any army. He wrote decrees with the same intensity he commanded armies, knowing that a law or proclamation could shape a city as much as a cannonball shaped a field. Each word, each signature, carried the weight of empires. Napoleon's personal world, too, was a landscape of contradictions. Josephine, with her grace and unpredictable charm, remained both solace and temptation. Their love, passionate and tempestuous, mirrored the conflicts of the empire, intense, consuming, and sometimes painfully fragile. Generals and ministers were loyal, but loyalty was a complex dance of respect, fear, and ambition. Every interaction required careful observation. Every word could inspire or betray, and Napoleon moved through these relationships with the same meticulous precision that guided his armies. As the Iron Tide surged, the human cost became unavoidable. The smoke of battle, the cries of the wounded, the hollow-eyed survivors, they were reminders that empires were not abstract constructs but lived realities. He felt their weight with the soldier's discipline and the philosopher's reflection. For every victory, there was loss. For every conquered city, a population adjusting to new rulers. His mind never stopped calculating, never stopped imagining, never stopped weighing consequence against ambition. The campaigns themselves were spectacles of speed, coordination, and audacity. Columns of infantry, cavalry charges, and artillery barrages unfolded with a precision that bewildered allies and enemies alike. Napoleon's ability to anticipate movements, to see several steps ahead, to manipulate terrain and time, made him appear almost superhuman. Yet even as victories piled up, he knew that the tide of war was never infinite, that fortune favored the bold only so long, and that every campaign sowed the seeds of future struggles. Across Europe, whispers of the emperor's ambition grew louder. In Vienna, London, and St. Petersburg, rulers feared not only his armies, but the idea of him, a man capable of bending nations to his will, capable of reshaping history itself. The Iron Tide was more than military conquest. It was a psychological force, a wave of inevitability that made resistance seem almost futile. Yet Napoleon never underestimated the power of human resilience. He respected it, calculated it, and often used it against itself, turning fear into leverage, hesitation into opportunity. Even in triumph, the emperor remained a man of reflection and solitude. Nights in his chambers were filled with contemplation of what had been gained and what had been lost. He considered not only the maps and victories, but the fleeting nature of time, the fragile thread that connected ambition to mortality. Greatness demanded sacrifice, and he carried the weight of lives and history with a constant, disciplined awareness. He knew that empires were temporary, but the impression of a life, a vision, could echo far beyond the fall of kings or the boundaries of borders. As dusk fell across the fields of Europe, Napoleon stood upon another ridge, the wind carrying the scent of gunpowder and earth. Below him, armies rested and cities waited, the world suspended in the tension between conquest and survival. He was the master of the Iron Tide, the force beyond the momentum of history, a man whose mind and ambition shaped the destiny of nations. Yet in the quiet of evening, even amid the brilliance of strategy and the poetry of victory, he carried the solitary knowledge that power, for all its grandeur, was fragile and that every triumph contained the seeds of challenge to come. Napoleon moved onward through campaigns, through diplomacy, through history itself, leaving in his wake the mark of a man who dared to dream beyond the possible.
He was the emperor of an unstoppable tide, a force that reshaped continents and minds alike. Yet even he, brilliant and audacious, understood that the world he commanded was as unpredictable as it was vast, as beautiful as it was perilous. The iron tide surged, unstoppable yet uncertain, and Napoleon, at its crest, continued to dream, to conquer, and to shape the world according to the vision of a man who refused to be anything less than legendary. Chapter